it was a world divided by a river. On the one hand, the order measurable by miles, the network of roads, cities, laws and taxes that was the Roman Empire under Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. On the other, beyond the great liquid barrier of the Danube, a perpetually moving mosaic of peoples, unstable alliances and primordial forces. For decades, that river, the Danubian limes, had been more of a customs house than a trench, a permeable border through which goods, mercenaries and influences flowed. But in the winter between 166 and 167 AD, that line would be transformed, in a few cold months, into the threshold of a nightmare. To understand the trauma of that initial invasion, we need to look at the world as it was a moment before the impact, when the system, perfect on paper, began to creak under pressures that Rome had seriously underestimated. The Danube, in Pannonia and Noricum, was not an impassable wall, but a sophisticated nervous control system. A sequence of legionary fortresses, such as Carnuntum, base of the 14 Gemina, or Vindobona, served as its backbone. Among them, a network of smaller forts, castella, and signal towers, burgi, housed the garrisons of the Limitanii, soldier peasants whose task was the surveillance and interception of small bands of raiders. Military roads ran parallel to the river, allowing rapid travel. It was a formidable apparatus against traditional threats, effective for control, for the collection of duties, to impress with its mass of stone and wood. But its strength was also its rigidity. It was designed to filter, not to withstand a flood. And just beyond that line lived the neighbors, people that Rome knew well and with which it had ambiguous relationships. The Marcomanni, the people of the march or of the border, were perhaps the most powerful. Settled in today's Bohemia, after the Germanic wars of Augustus they had built a structured kingdom, a sort of distorted mirror of Roman power, with a monarchy, a warrior nobility, and a certain familiarity with the arts of diplomacy and commerce. They were not strangers, but often uncomfortable interlocutors. To the east of them, the more fragmented and volatile Quadi, in Moravia and western Slovakia, traditionally clients of Rome but whose loyalties fluctuated as imperial gifts and the strength of the legions varied. And even further east, in the Hungarian plains east of the Danube, the Sarmatian Iazyges, a people of steppe horsemen, culturally alien, feared for their armored cavalry charges, mercenaries at times, raiders at others. This was the known panorama. But behind them, in the shadow of the forests and lands of the north, new and faceless forces were moving, the Lombards and the Vituali. Rome knew little about them, only that they were numerous, hungry for land, and that they were moving. And it is here that the fatal dynamic is triggered, what historians call the domino effect, or pressure of the people. It was not a conspiracy of barbarians thirsty for Roman riches. It was a chain reaction triggered by distant migrations, perhaps from the coasts of the Baltic or from the depths of Germany. Driven by climatic or demographic reasons or in turn by other peoples, the Lombards and the Vituali pressed towards the southwest, looking for a territory in which to settle. Their impact landed against the shoulders of the Marcomanni and the Quadi. These, in turn, found themselves crushed between the pressure of the new arrivals and the Roman barrier. Faced with the choice between a fratricidal clash against ferocious people like them, or the attempt to break through the Roman dam, the decision was, in a certain sense, forced. The Danube became the only possible relief valve. Rome, absorbed in its grandeur, did not grasp the significance of this dynamic. Danger, for the imperial mentality, always had a face and a name, an enemy king, a rebellious tribe. He could not conceive of the impersonal and overwhelming force of an entire people in motion, in desperation. Added to this strategic blindness was a tragic situation. For 4 years, from 161 to 166 AD, Rome's attention and best military energies had been absorbed by a demanding war in the east, against the Parthian Empire. Marcus Aurelius had sent co-emperor Lucius Verus and his best generals to lead that campaign. Legions were transferred, including from the Danube front. The garrisons along the river were thinned out, left to a skeletal workforce. When the victorious troops returned, they brought with them a disastrous gift, the so-called Antonine Plague, probably smallpox or measles, a disease unknown to the immune system of the Mediterranean which spread with horrible rapidity among the ranks of the army and among the civilian population, decimating their forces and morale. Thus, at the critical moment, the Danube limes was garrisoned by exhausted men, reduced in number, while the empire was tested physically and financially by the Eastern conflict. The atmosphere along the border, in the autumn of 166, must have been full of restless tension. The German merchants who crossed the river for the usual exchanges brought alarming rumors, clan gatherings, unusual preparations, an air of departure. In the castellas, veteran centurions, accustomed to reading the signs of the steppe and forest, sensed a change. The patrols reported an unusual movement of groups in the border areas. It was more than the usual pre-winter buzz. It was the rumble of an approaching earthquake. And beyond the river, in the great goats of the Marcomanni, or around the fires of the Quadi, the tribal leaders and warriors had to look north, towards the lands from which frightened refugees and news of violence arrived, and then south, towards the warm and fertile plains of Pannonia, protected only by that river and those towers. The choice became more stringent every day. Rome slept, or rather, dozed in its Parthian victory, unaware that the greatest challenge in its recent history would come not from a rival empire, but from the cold chaos of the north, and that its first act would not be a declaration of war, but the simple, desperate act of walking across a frozen river. Everything was ready for the great winter, the winter in which the border would give way. The winter of 166, 167 AD descended on Europe with an exceptional grip of frost, a climatic event that the memory of men and the chronicles recorded as an omen. The great Danube River, for centuries the liquid bulwark of the empire, the dividing line between the known world and the unknown, began to change shape. Its tumultuous waters, which for months had discouraged armies and separated cultures, calmed down, thickened, transformed into a smooth and continuous sheet of ice. What technology and the will of Rome could not cross without permission, nature now made accessible to anyone. The limes was no longer a barrier. It had become a bridge. A bridge as wide as the horizon, which led straight into the heart of the provinces. That was the moment the pressure became full-on. What Roman sources simply call the invasion of the Marcomanni was not a military operation in the classical sense. It was an armed migration, a desperate exodus of entire communities driven by an existential necessity. It wasn't just the armies that moved. The people moved. They advanced slowly, like a human glacier, through the bare forests of Bohemia and Moravia towards the northern banks of the river. They weren't just columns of warriors in battle gear. It was a chaotic, tragic river of humanity. Old men and children wrapped in furs, women pushing carts pulled by exhausted oxen, flocks of sheep and goats, dogs barking in the bitter cold. And in the midst of this tide, the hard cores of the valid men, the warriors, with the painted wooden shields hanging from their shoulders and the framei in their hands, their watchful and desperate gaze turned back, towards the lands they abandoned forever, and forward, towards the mirage of survival that was the empire. The crossing did not take place in just one point, as in an epic ford battle. It happened everywhere. In a myriad of anonymous places, where the ice seemed more solid, small and large groups broke away from the northern shore and began walking. The silence must have been eerie, broken only by the crackle of ice beneath thousands of feet, the cry of a child, the low lowing of cattle. On the other side, from the Roman watchtowers, the Limitanine sentries saw an unimaginable procession looming at dawn against the freezing fog. They weren't the usual gangs of 20 or so raiders. It was an infinite humanity. They sounded the alarm and lit the signal fires. But the system, designed to contain limited spills, went haywire. The fires lit up one after the other along the entire horizon, a sinister telegraphic message that said only one thing, everywhere. The small blockhouses, the castellas designed to house a few dozen men, were surrounded and overwhelmed with terrifying ease. Their wooden and earth palisades, effective against a local assault, were simply overtaken by the tide. Some garrisons attempted a desperate sortie and were submerged, annihilated in brief, brutal hand-to-hand battles on the icy slopes. Others, besieged and without hope of reinforcements, had to surrender, seeing their warehouses looted and their houses set on fire. The Roman tactic of static defense, of keeping the point, turned out to be suicide. The barbarians were not there to conquer fortresses. They were there to go through it. They avoided long sieges whenever possible. They simply isolated them, left them to starve behind them, and moved on. The devastation they left behind was not just an act of savagery, but of brutal logistics, living off the land. Roman villages and villi rustica were plundered for food, ovens for grain, animals for meat, houses for wood to burn. It was a war of survival that fed on the destruction of what it found. And while the border provinces, Pannonia and Noricum, began to burn, the news began to travel along the Roman roads, perhaps faster than the invaders themselves. Messengers on horseback, covered in mud and terror, galloped towards the legionary headquarters of Carnuntum and Aquileia, bringing contradictory and apocalyptic news: the river has fallen. There are thousands, tens of thousands. They crossed the border in force. The Roman administrative machine, normally so efficient, struggled to understand the extent of the catastrophe. At first it was thought of a major incursion, to be punished with a punitive expedition. But the reports piled up, all equally desperate. And in Rome, the emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, still immersed in the celebrations for the Parthian triumph, received the news as a blow to the heart. The party was over. The nightmare had begun. The empire, which a few months earlier had celebrated its greatest triumphal expansion in the east, now found itself torn apart at home, in its northwest courtyard. And the tide, inexorable, did not stop. Having overcome the front lines, the hordes poured into the internal plains, divided into large groups heading towards the richest spoils, the cities. Their final destination, the objective that no external enemy had seen for centuries, became clear, pulsating in the frost: the Alps. And beyond the Alps, the warm, very rich, mythical soil of Italy. To understand the shock force that hit the Danube limes, it is necessary to strip it of the Roman definition of army, and look at it for what it really was: an entire society on the march, an armed migration whose war instrument coincided with its vital structure. This was not a force organized into legions and cohorts, but a mobile collection of clans and families, where the line between combatant and non-combatant was thin and shifting. At the center of this moving body were the warriors, the backbone of defense and offense. The German freeman was not a professional soldier. War was a rite of passage, a social obligation, the main route to honor and prestige. His psychology at that juncture was not dictated by discipline, but by a powerful mixture of existential desperation, the homeland now impassable behind him, and a ferocious aspiration to conquer a new one. He saw in the Roman Empire not only the enemy to be feared, but the prize to be snatched: fertile lands, unimaginable riches, a future for his own clan. This desperation-greed dualism generated a particular, unscrupulous and reckless courage, which the Romans struggled to fully understand. The armament of this warrior perfectly reflected his fighting philosophy: mobile, personal, based on initial impact and melee. The weapon par excellence was the framea, a long thrusting spear that could also be thrown with terrible effectiveness at short distances. The shield, long and flat, was made of thick wood, sometimes reinforced with a metal umbo, lighter than the heavy Roman scutum and ideal for quick parries and to form, if necessary, a primitive but compact Germanic tortoise. From the belt hung the short sword or the combat knife, and above all the war axe, a work tool transformed into a lethal weapon, capable of severing limbs and breaking through shields with a single blow. They rarely wore metal armor, except perhaps simple helmets or those stolen from the Romans. Their strength was in mobility, number, and a ferocity that sought to annihilate the enemy in the first, devastating contact. But the invasion was not the work of the Germans alone. To the east, the Sarmatian Iazyges represented a completely different tactical element and therefore even more disturbing for the defenders. People of the steppes, their life was symbiotic with the horse. Their cavalry, partly protected by iron or bone scales, cataphractarii in embryo, brandished the very long two-handed spear, the contus, and was trained in compact and overwhelming charges. In battle they acted as hammers, breaking through already engaged lines. During the invasion, their function was probably that of long-range scouts, fast flankers who protected the slow flanks of the Germanic migration, and lightning-fast raiders, capable of hitting distant targets and sowing panic far beyond the front line. Their simple presence, with shining armor and flying dragon insignia, must have instilled an ancestral fear in the Roman provincials, accustomed to an enemy who was predominantly infantry. Across the river, the Roman defenders embodied an opposite principle: specialization. The first to receive the impact were the Limitanii, the border soldiers. They were not the legendary heavy legionary infantry, but garrison troops, often discharged veterans who had been given a plot of land in exchange for permanent service along the border. Their armament could have been lighter, less standardized. Their strength lay in their knowledge of the territory and their ability to man permanent positions. Against a raiding band, they were effective. Against a human wave, they were simply swallowed up. In support, there were probably some vexellations, detachments of legionaries taken from the main fortresses such as Carnuntum, perhaps reduced in strength for the Parthian War. These were the pros, with the Larica segmentata, the Great Scutum, the Pilum and the Gladius. But they were too few, too scattered, and caught in an unsuitable state of psychological preparation. They were prepared for a frontier war of skirmishes and punitive expeditions, not the end of their known world. The clash between these two entities, in the initial phase of the invasion, was therefore not a battle, but a series of asymmetric military tragedies. Roman tactics, based on discipline, the cohesion of the shield line and the coordinated movement of large units, presupposed an enemy who accepted pitched battle. The Germans and Sarmatians did not accept him. Their tactic was that of penetration and dispersal, avoiding strong points, infiltrating between them, plundering the territory, forcing the Romans to divide their already small forces to protect a myriad of objectives. It was a form of liquid warfare that rendered the Roman heavy war machine useless. An anecdote, perhaps legendary but emblematic, tells of a centurion of the Limitanii who, seeing not an assault column approaching but an entire tribe with chariots, livestock and lit fires, exclaimed, "They are not coming to fight. They are coming to stay." It was the perception of a demographic, rather than military, apocalypse. Archaeological evidence of this chaos is found today in places such as the Cannabaica, Zeiselmauer, fort in Naricum, where layers of destruction dated to those years show signs of violent fire and, significantly, a total absence of human remains. Perhaps the garrison was wiped out elsewhere, in a desperate sortie, or perhaps it was simply overwhelmed and scattered, its men swallowed by the tide, their weapons broken and their fort reduced to a pile of embers in the long winter night of the border. Reconstructing a detailed chronology of the first months of the scourge is a desperate undertaking, like trying to trace the path of individual streams in a flood that submerges entire valleys. The Roman sources, Cassius Dio first and foremost, give us the glow of the besieged cities and the name of some lost battle, but the real drama took place in hundreds of nameless places, where small garrisons died forgotten and rural communities vanished without leaving a trace except a layer of ash on the ground. However, following the flashes of the disaster, it is possible to outline the advance of the shadow. After breaking through the frozen Danube, the horde divided into large groups, like rivers seeking the easiest path. One, the most powerful, headed southwest, threatening the heart of Pannonia. Here stood Carnuntum, the mighty fortress of the Legio XIV Gemina Martia Victrix, the pivot of the entire defensive system. It is plausible, even if not directly attested, that the first real Roman attempt at organized resistance took place right here. A detachment of legionaries, perhaps supported by the few Limitanii survivors in the area, may have lined up in an open field to block the road to the barbarian mass. The clash, if it occurred, had no history. The Romans, outnumbered, worn out by surprise and perhaps already infected by the disease that the troops returning from the east brought to the barracks, were overwhelmed. The battle, or rather, the massacre, near Carnuntum marked the collapse of any hope of containment in the province. The fortress itself, if it was not conquered, was isolated, transforming into a besieged island in a hostile sea. With its spine broken, Pannonia was opened to plunder. At the same time, another wave hit further west, in Naricum. Here the objective was not a legionary fortress, but the Roman administrative and commercial centers, tangible symbols of the wealth to be plundered. The city of Ovalava, today's Wells, a thriving municipality, was probably invested first. Its walls, suitable for repelling bands of bandits, were probably unable to withstand the siege of thousands of determined warriors. The fall of Ovalava, perhaps followed by that of other smaller centers such as Lauriacum, left the province in chaos. The Naritians, a Celtic population Romanized for centuries, suddenly found themselves naked, without the military protection on which they had based their peaceful existence. It was a trauma that burned in the collective memory, and it is no coincidence that centuries later, when the now collapsed empire was only a memory, tales of horrid Huns survived in local legends which perhaps concealed the echo of those terrible Marcomannic days. But the real shock, the event that shook the Capitoline Hill in Rome, was the subsequent, unprecedented move of the barbarians. Having passed the Noric Alps or through the passages of Pannonia, large groups of warriors, perhaps the most battle-hardened, those who had traveled lightest, poured into the Pa Valley. For the first time since Hannibal's time, an external enemy crossed the Alps not by agreement, but by force. And for the first time in the history of the empire, since the dark days of the Cimbrian War over 2 centuries earlier, Italian soil was violated by a barbarian invasion. Their destination became Aquileia, the very rich metropolis of Venetia, gateway to the east, emporium of precious goods and symbol of Italian opulence. The siege of Aquileia, in the year 167, is a certain historical fact, and its psychological significance cannot be overestimated. The city walls resisted, but the mere fact that the Barbarica could lay siege to it, that the smoke of their camps was visible from its towers, represented the definitive collapse of a dogma, the inviolability of Italy. In Rome, the news generated panic that bordered on hysteria. The worst was feared. It is said that Marcus Aurelius himself, realizing the gravity of the situation while he was still in the capital, took extraordinary measures to recruit new legions, going so far as to recruit slaves, gladiators and even bands of Dalmatian brigands, just to have men to throw into the furnace of the north. It was the instinctive response of an organism hit at a vital point. The Roman counteroffensive, however, was slow to materialize. The legions had to be gathered, transferred, equipped. The Antonine Plague, meanwhile, claimed victims in the crowded camps, weakening the response before it even started. And while the consuls and the emperor were organizing the defense, in the countryside around Aquileia, and perhaps even further south, up to Opitergium, Oderzo, itself, the Germanic and Sarmatian bands moved with a chilling freedom, demonstrating that between the border and the heart of the empire there was no longer any effective filter. That 2-year period, 166-167, was not the beginning of a war. It was the collapse of a system. And the sound of the barbaric horns that under the walls of Aquileia was the death knell that announced the end of an era of security now taken for granted, a sound that would echo for centuries in Roman consciences, every time the freezing wind blew from the north. The barbaric impetus that swept away the garrisons of the limes was not the result of chance or individual courage alone. It was the brutal and large-scale application of a military doctrine diametrically opposed to the Roman one, a doctrine made of movement, dispersion and targeted blows at the exposed nerves of the empire. While the Roman war machine was a heavy hammer designed to crush armies deployed in an open field, the Germanic and Sarmatian horde functioned like a swarm of sharp blades, cutting precisely because they had no fixed center to hit. Their strategy was not aimed at territorial conquest in the Roman sense of the term, but at overcoming the enemy system through plunder, economic devastation, and psychological collapse. And in those first 2 years, this strategy proved frighteningly effective. At the heart of the barbaric tactic was the refusal of the decisive frontal clash, at least until it was strictly necessary. Why give battle to a handful of deployed legionaries, when they could ignore, bypass and hit what those legionaries were there to protect? The defenseless villages, the grain warehouses, the landowners' villas. It was elementary and ruthless logic. Movement speed was their force multiplier. Free from the cumbersome baggage train that slowed down every Roman army. Literally living off the land they plundered, Germanic groups could move with a speed that baffled imperial commanders. They received information from prisoners, from fugitive slaves, from merchants. They knew the weak points of Roman geography better than the new prefects sent from Italy. Theirs was a war of local knowledge, applied with systematic violence. The use of the land was master. The forests were not obstacles, but allies, invisible corridors from which to suddenly burst onto the Roman roads and then disappear again, loaded with loot. The smaller rivers, frozen like the Danube, became secondary highways. The favorite tactic was the ambush, the lightning ambush. A Roman detachment marching to bring relief to a besieged fort could be attacked in a wooded gorge, hit by a cloud of framii hurled from the thick vegetation before the charge of bare-chested, screaming warriors overwhelmed the disorganized ranks. There was no time to form the tortoise, to throw the pila into formation. It was chaos, the individual melee where the brute strength and single combat experience of the Germanic had the upper hand over the collective discipline of the Roman. The Sarmatian knights, then, were the masters of raid warfare. Their very long-range incursions, sometimes covering tens of kilometers in a single day, served to mislead, to sow panic in areas considered safe, to force the Romans to further disperse their forces in useless manhunts. Their simple presence, always reported but never precisely localized, was a continuous nervous wear. Faced with this moving plague, Roman military doctrine appeared, for the first time in centuries, terribly inadequate. The lime system was the perfect example of an elastic defense rigidified in a static cage. Designed to control, filter, punish, it was totally vulnerable to a mass breakthrough. Its garrisons, fixed like nails on a map, could be isolated and neutralized one by one. The very concept of front vanished. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The legions, when they finally moved, marched towards points that had now evaporated, finding only piles of smoking rubble and devastated fields. The Roman logistical genius, which allowed armies of tens of thousands of men to be supported in hostile territories, became a heavy burden when the territory itself was the enemy, emptied of every resource. The initial Roman reaction was therefore slow, confused, and ineffective. It was based on wrong assumptions, that the enemy wanted to conquer fortresses, that he was looking for a pitched battle, that he could be thrown back across the river with a single large thrust. The historian Cassius Dio captures the essence of this strategic misunderstanding in an illuminating anecdote. He says that the Roman commanders, questioning some barbarian prisoners about the reason for such a vast and apparently senseless invasion, did not receive the classic answer about greed for riches or hatred for Rome. The prisoners simply pointed north, back to the lands from which they had come, and said, "They came, and they drove us out." It was the explanation of an inertial force, of a chain reaction. The Romans found themselves fighting not against a political opponent with whom to negotiate, but against a natural phenomenon, the migration of peoples, and they had no conceptual tools to deal with it, other than the sword. This initial tactical blindness cost provinces, cities, and tens of thousands of lives. It was only when Marcus Aurelius and his generals, such as the trusty Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus, understood that it was not a question of repelling an incursion but of waging a war of annihilation and reconquest, that the Roman military machine began to adapt, to become more mobile, to fight fire with fire. But that understanding came at the cost of an unprecedented 2 years of blood, fire, and humiliation, the necessary prelude to 2 decades of war that would consume the very soul of the empire. The price of those 2 years of uninterrupted violence was not measured only in conquered fortresses or lost battlefields. The toll presented by the invasions of 166, 167 AD was of such vastness as to tear the very fabric of the Danubian provinces and to leave a deep wound in the psyche of the empire. The material devastation was systematic and frightening. Pannonia and Noricum, for decades placid border provinces where Roman life had taken root with agricultural villas, artisan villages and thriving markets, were reduced to a lunar landscape. Entire regions were depopulated. Villages were obliterated, leaving only charred layers in the soil that archaeologists today call, with an aseptic term, horizons of destruction. The rustic villas, symbol of agrarian romanization, were sacked and set on fire, their mosaic floors broken, grain ovens destroyed, cellars emptied. The countryside, deprived of farmers killed or deported and of livestock raided, fell into a state of abandonment that would take generations to remediate. Commercial networks, based on the safety of the roads, broke down. The human booty was immense. Thousands of Roman and provincial civilians were killed, and many more, especially women and children, were dragged away into slavery across the Danube, a human commodity that would repopulate German villages and enrich their leaders. It was a forced transplant of the population in the opposite direction to that of Romanization. On this scenario of physical death, a biological scourge of catastrophic scope was grafted, the Antonine Plague. The disease, almost certainly smallpox, had been brought to the west by Lucius Verus troops returning from the Parthian campaign. Under the normal conditions of a well-fed and connected empire, perhaps its virulence would have been contained. But the invasions created the perfect conditions for its epidemic explosion. The military camps, where the new recruits, slaves, gladiators, desperate volunteers, were hastily amassed, became infernal hotbeds of contagion. The large population movements, both of the invaders and of the fleeing Roman refugees, acted as ideal vectors, transporting the disease along all the routes of the empire. The famine resulting from the devastation of the countryside further weakened the immune defenses of an already exhausted population. The plague made no distinction between Romans and barbarians, between soldiers and civilians, but its impact on the Roman military apparatus, already tested by defeats, was paralyzing. Entire units had to be disbanded or quarantined, counteroffensive plans delayed or cancelled due to a lack of healthy men. It was a blow to Rome's already wan response capabilities, an invisible enemy weakening his arm as he tried to grasp the sword. The economic and moral crisis that followed was unprecedented in the history of the Antonine Age. In Rome, financial panic followed military panic. The currency, the silver denarius, began its journey towards a devaluation that would become unstoppable in the following century. To finance the war, Marcus Aurelius found himself having to resort to extreme measures, selling the personal treasures of the imperial house at public auction in Trajan's Forum. Jewels, gold and silver pottery, precious silks, even palace furniture. It was a spectacle of authentic, dramatic necessity that deeply impressed his contemporaries. The philosopher-emperor forced to sell off the very symbols of power to pay for the defense of the empire. But this gesture, however noble, was the symptom of a terrible truth. The state coffers were empty. The Parthian War had drained the reserves, and now this new, immense calamity required a financial effort that the imperial economy, based on a constant flow of tribute from peaceful provinces, was unable to sustain without profound trauma. In this whirlwind, a personal event became entwined with collective tragedy, adding another layer of difficulty. In 169 AD, during the preparations for the reconquest campaign, the co-emperor Lucius Verus suddenly died. The sources disagree, perhaps a stroke, perhaps a victim of the same plague that afflicted his soldiers. His death left Marcus Aurelius as sole ruler, depriving him not only of a colleague, although often described as dissolute and not inclined to govern, but of a legitimate figure to whom he could delegate part of the military command or internal administration. It was an additional burden on the already hunched shoulders of the emperor, who now had to be everywhere. Supreme commander at the front, administrator in Rome, judge, priest. The isolation of power became darker. It was in this period, among the tents of the camps along the Danube, that Marcus Aurelius probably wrote some of the most bitter reflections of his thoughts, such as that fragment in which he observes, "A man who flees from his enemies. But are his enemies themselves the ones who flee? It doesn't matter. He flees anyway." It is the philosophical echo of the panic and desertion that he must have seen with his own eyes, the attempt to give a stoic meaning to the chaos that surrounded him. The security of the world, the very foundation of the Pax Romana on which his thought and government rested, had dissolved. In its place, only the smoke from the burned provinces, the moaning of the sick in the field hospitals, and the endless barrage of tragic news from a border that no longer held. The 2-year period of the invasion did not end with a decisive battle, but with a wounded, impoverished, sick and psychologically shaken empire, forced to face its own vulnerability. The trauma of the years 166, 167 did not end in the count of deaths and the extent of material damage. Those events served as a powerful catalyst, forcing Rome into a profound, painful revision of its entire strategic doctrine for survival. The lesson taught by frost and iron was clear and irrevocable. The old world was over. The defensive system that for a century had guaranteed the Pax Romana along the Danube, a thin line of forts and watchtowers supported by a few powerful legionary fortresses, had revealed itself to be a sieve in the face of the demographic pressure of entire populations on the move. From that awareness was born a new military philosophy, whose echo would resonate for centuries to come, until the twilight of the Western Empire. The passive defense of the limes was abandoned forever. Marcus Aurelius and his generals understood that it was no longer enough to push back. It was necessary to project force deep into the heart of the barbarian territories, to annihilate the enemy's offensive capacity and dissuade any desire for invasion for future generations. The Marcomannic War ceased to be a frontier crisis to become a war of conquest and total punishment, with a bold and unprecedented objective: the creation of two new provinces, Marcomannia and Sarmatia, north of the Danube. It was the dream of physically moving the border, of forcibly assimilating those peoples who could no longer be kept out. This paradigm shift entailed a profound transformation of the army itself. The Roman army of the 2nd century, still essentially the one forged by Augustus, began to adapt to the needs of a new, more mobile and fluid war. There was a significant increase in the importance of cavalry. The wings of auxiliary knights, increasingly often recruited from steppe peoples or Germans themselves, became essential not only for reconnaissance and pursuit, but as real shock units capable of countering the Sarmatian knights on their own terrain. The legionary infantry, the traditional backbone of the army, began that slow process of transformation that would lead it, in the following decades, to be lighter, more flexible, less dependent on heavy armor and mass deployment. Above all, the principle, already present but never so decisive, of barbarian recruitment was definitively established. To fight the barbarians, Rome began to enlist the barbarians. Entire friendly tribes were settled within the empire, in exchange for military service, dedititiae. German and Sarmatian warriors were integrated not only as auxiliaries, but gradually also into the ranks of the legions themselves. It was the beginning of that process of barbarization, which, from an emergency solution, would become the backbone of late Roman imperial defense, with all the ambiguities and dangers it entailed. At the same time, the Danube provinces themselves underwent a genetic mutation. Pannonia, Noricum and Rhaetia ceased to be simple administered territories to become permanently militarized zones. The cities surrounded themselves with thicker and higher walls, no longer just a symbol of status, but a vital necessity. The economy reoriented itself to serve the needs of a standing army of a size never seen in those regions. Civil society adapted to living in the shadow of the camps, in a forced symbiosis with military power. The civil and municipal imprint of Romanization retreated, replaced by the cruder imprint of the military field. And it was precisely from the generals who conducted these long wars on the Danube, the Claudians, the Severans, that within a few decades, the new ruling class of the empire would emerge, rough, practical, devoted solely to military efficiency, in stark contrast to the Italian senatorial and philosophical aristocracy represented by Marcus Aurelius. But the most profound consequence, perhaps, was psychological and cultural. The legend of the inviolability of Italy and of Roman invincibility was shattered forever under the walls of Aquileia. The Pax Romana proved not to be a cosmic fact, but a precarious condition, constantly threatened by dark and uncontrollable forces. A new sensibility was born, darker, more anxious, which would permeate the literature and thought of centuries to come. The world was no longer an orderly and safe space to be civilized, but an island of light surrounded by an increasingly threatening ocean of darkness. The siege had become the very metaphor of imperial existence. And this perception materialized in the stone of the Column of Marcus Aurelius in Rome. If Trajan's column celebrated the orderly and triumphant conquest of Dacia, that of Marcus Aurelius tells an epic of suffering, of fatigue, of desperate miracles, such as that of the rain that saves the lightning legion, of a tiring victory against a dark and inhuman enemy. The figures of the barbarians, often represented with a pathetic crudeness, convey a sense of pity and terror at the same time. It is the monument to an empire that no longer conquers, but which survives. Those initial 2 years, therefore, were not just a military crisis. They forged the prototype of all future crises, forced Rome to reinvent itself to survive, and inaugurated the era of wars of defense, migrations of peoples and the slow, inexorable fusion between the Roman and barbarian worlds. The Danube stopped being a border to become a violent and fruitful contact zone, the place where the destiny of future Europe began to take shape in fire and blood. The roar of the weapons and the crackle of the fires of the 2 years 167 AD died down, but their echo would never again abandon the halls of Roman power, nor the collective conscience of the empire. Those events did not constitute a limited war episode, but rather the harbinger of an entire historical era, the prologue of a tragedy that would unfold for the following 3 centuries. The siege of Aquileia was the first, terrifying ringing of a bell that would continue to ring with each new wave. Goths, Alemanni, Huns, Vandals. A psychological barrier more powerful than any wall had been broken. The certainty that the heart of the empire was untouchable. From that moment, the north ceased to be a land of barbaric traders or similar mercenaries, and became the threatening cradle of peoples in search of a destiny, the inexhaustible reservoir of demographic and military pressure that Rome could have contained, slowed down, directed, but never eliminated again. The Marcomannic Wars in their entirety, triggered by that initial breakthrough, were the first gigantic clash between the Mediterranean organizational principle and the chaotic and migratory force of continental Europe. A clash that Rome, with immense effort, won on the field, but which it paid for by irreparably weakening its structures. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher forced to live as a general, is the tragic figure who dominates this transition. He literally spent the rest of his life, 13 long years, along the muddy banks of the Danube, no longer as an imperial visitor, but as a forced resident of an immense armed camp. His victory, achieved at the cost of exhausting and ruthless campaigns, was nullified by the haste and lust for glory of his son and successor, Commodus. The peace treaties of 180 A.D., stipulated by the young emperor eager to return to the comforts of Rome, effectively cancelled his father's annexation project. The Marcomanni and Quadi, although subjugated, remained on the other side of the river, like a dormant volcano. The border was reconstituted, fortified, but not moved. The sacrifice of an emperor and an entire generation of soldiers had restored the status quo ante, not created a new security. It was a Pyrrhic victory on an epical scale. The empire had repelled the invader, but it was poorer, sicker, more militarized and more cynical than before. Marcus Aurelius, the last of the good emperors, according to ancient historiography, involuntarily closed an era. After him, the commanders of the Danubian legions would learn that true power no longer resided in Rome, but in the blade of the sword they held in their hands. The Danube itself, after those trials, was never the same again. From an administrative border it became the line of fire, the place of a forced and violent symbiosis. Its southern bank was populated by barbarian veterans, settlements of dedititii, mercenaries and their families. The material culture of the bordering provinces became a hybrid, a Danubian style, in which Roman fibulae mingled with Germanic ornaments, and Romano-Celtic grain ovens stood alongside barbarian-style mud and wood huts. It was the microscopic image of a macroscopic process, integration through force and necessity. The strategic lesson learned, that mobile armies and defensive depth were needed, laid the foundation for 3rd century army reform and for Diocletian's tetrarchy, which divided command precisely to respond to simultaneous threats on distant fronts. And the practice of settling entire foederate tribes within the borders, experimented in those decades, became the norm in the 4th and 5th centuries, until the barbarians inside became more numerous and powerful than those outside. Looking back, the Great Winter of 166-167 stands out not as an isolated event, but as the first, very clear symptom of a fever that would consume the body of the Western Empire. It indicated that external pressure had exceeded a critical threshold. He demonstrated that the Roman economy and demographics were no longer capable of absorbing shocks indefinitely without undergoing radical transformations. Above all, it revealed that the balance on which the Pax Romana rested was exceptionally fragile. The dam had held, but showed deep cracks. The tumultuous waters of the north had demonstrated that they could submerge it, and would continue to press against it, flood after flood, until the day when the doors would not be broken down, but simply opened from the inside by whoever now represented those waters. The conclusion of this initial phase, therefore, is not the story of how Rome repelled an invasion, but of how an invasion changed Rome forever. The cold of that petrified Danube penetrated the bones of the empire and never left. The rest would have been a long, tenacious, heroic, and often desperate resistance, the struggle of a civilization to survive its own decline, aware, after those first terrible 2 years, that night had finally fallen and that the lights along the river were no longer those of the markets, but of sentry fires in a world that had become, forever, a battlefield.